Welcome yet again to Can You Believe It? We believe our truth is God's truth, whether that's in social sciences and physics and mathematics or chemistry. And our responsibility as scholars is to search everywhere matter and life exists and to find that which is truthful, wherever it may be found, analyze it and share it with all creatures, big and small, on God's green earth. We've been exploring the issue of race and the foundations of racism as we know it today. We've been asking the question, how did we get here? What went wrong with the sons of mankind? Well, on one side, we can argue evil nature and the unclean slate, which is true. We are born with an evil nature and the desire to do that which is not moral and ethical. Apostle Paul speaks about this in Romans chapter 7. Listen to Apostle Paul's compelling argument on the evil nature that we all possess. Apostle Paul writes in Romans chapter 7, verse 15, I quote, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I, myself, who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it. So I find the law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being, I delight in God's law. But I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? What a wretched man I am. Aren't we all? We are so evil and selfish as humans that if we are not watched carefully, mankind will enslave his own sister. What wretched men and women, for that matter, we are. Again, we've been looking a little bit deeper at the science and the philosophy and how scholars in the 17th and 18th centuries influenced and propagated the myth of race. Some of these early scholars specialized in the fields of biology and zoology and medicine. And so they had credibility right from the very going. I mean, they were scientists. We saw briefly the influence of Blomenbach on biology and how his attempt to classify humans into variations have affected humanity to this very day. I promised to cover a famous biologist by the name of Baptiste Lamarck and a French philosopher by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But I want to skip that for another day and look at the influence of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species on African morality. That sounds like a tough one. So how does Charles Darwin's Origin of Species theory affect or influence African morality? How did Charles Darwin's theory on the origin of species influence African morality? That's a question I want to explore. I ask this question first because I'm an African scholar interested in African sociology, ethics, and morality. I ask this question because I engage with the social sciences and because I'm a theologian who believes that all truth is God's truth, no matter where that truth is found. God is the source of all truth. I begin by making the statement that can be supported by other scholars in the areas of sociology, that the philosophies of John Locke, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and Charles Darwin's theory of origin of species played a vital role in the attitudes of those early colonizers and early missionaries who were venturing into the African continent in the 18th and the 19th centuries. A scholar by the name of Mugambi from Kenya writes that in 2002. For instance, the writings and theories of a gentleman by the name of Francis Galton, who lived from 1822 through 1911, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin, believed that controlled breeding of humans was a doable thing and also a very highly desirable goal for the inquisitionists and for those who wanted to follow up with Blomenbach's ideas and with his theory of special breed theory. Francis Galton's thinking will very much influence much of Hitler's Germany and the spread of Arianism later in the 1930s and 1940s. Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, believed that the breeding of humans needed to be pursued, and his thinking, therefore, became key to prompting the elites of the 17th century to the 19th century to speed up the enslavement of Africans in the New Worlds. And also, Galton's thinking led to the denial of the African people in the New Worlds the right to propagate amongst themselves or with others for that matter. That is a thought that I borrow from Sussman, Richard Sussman, in his book, The Myth of Race, written in 2014. So Galton in 1869 believed that the average African intellectual standard was 2 grades below that of the Anglo-Saxons, and that they were morally incapable of running their own affairs. I did not write that. Again, Galton believed that the average African intellectual standard was 2 grades below that of the Anglo-Saxon, and they were morally incapable of running their own affairs. That is, again, Robert Sussman writing in 2012 in the book, The Myth of Race. Check it out for yourselves. But listen to this. In 1963, in a special series of televised lectures that were entitled The Rise of Christian Europe, and these lectures were heard from Oxford University by a known historian by the name of Hugh Trevor Roper. Roper, in the whole of himself, dismissed Africans or the history from Africa as meaningless. This is teaching originating from Oxford University, one of the best. Roper said that he says this without any shame in these lecturers that are televised, and I quote, this is exactly what Roper said, direct quote from Roper. Perhaps in the future, there will be some African history, but at present, there is none. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa, and the rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. End of quote. Again, African historian by the name of Ali Mazrui wrote that, quoting Roper, again, early in the 1920s. Ali Mazrui, famous historian from the African continent. So Roper's interpretation was part of a long-standing European school of thought that was adapted from Hegel, from Immanuel Kant, and David Hume, John Locke, Homer, and beyond. Homer, the Greek poet and author of Odyssey, said that, again a quote here from Homer himself, Africa is remote and sits at the universe's extreme, where people are morally incapable and all they do is worship and offer sacrifices to their gods. End of quote. That's quoted from Enslavement and Canoe in 2012. I also quote that from Mugambi, who writes in 2002. After that quote, all I can say is, ouch. Come on, Homer, be nice. Again, Africa is remote and seats of the universe is extreme, where people are morally incapable and all they do is worship and offer sacrifices to their gods. We are trying to understand, how did we get here, by asking critical questions that will lead us to the bottom of the issue. We're trying to understand how Charles Darwin's Origin of Species influenced African morality. And in the process, we are getting to interact a little bit with the philosophy and the ethics of the day. Now, listen to this. One of my favorite authors here, Thomas Jefferson, also one of the founding fathers of the American nation, quoting Hobbes, state that Africa is a timeless place without art, letters, or social organization. Instead, only fear and violent death dominated the continent. Jefferson writes that in 1784. Again, I can only say, ouch. This was the same Jefferson who writes the Declaration of Independence and added the phrase, or at least he was among the founding fathers who wrote the phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Jefferson. According to German philosopher by the name of George Friedrich Hegel, very well known, Hegel, writing in the 1800s, said that Africa was a historic continent where the people lived in mindless barbering without laws and morals. Quoted again by Enslavement and Kanu in 2012. Ali Mazrui quotes that phrase in 2002. Mugambi quotes that in 2002 as well. These were the minds of scholars with authority that were influencing the philosophy and the historical mindset of the early settlers, the missionaries, and the colonialists arriving in the African continent. That Africans were inferior and incapable of thinking morally and ethically. They could not make decisions by themselves because, again, they are buying into Blomenbach and other philosophers and scientists and biologians who were thinking of the Caucasians as being more of I want to say racially a superior race. Again, a Swiss philosopher by the name of Jacques-Jean Rousseau, whom I'm going to talk a little bit later in detail. Rousseau was a prolific writer and composer who greatly influenced a lot of, I want to say, political philosophy and the progress of the age of enlightenment throughout Europe, as well as aspects of the French Revolution and the development of modern political, economic, and educational thought. Said this. This is what Rousseau, Jacques Rousseau, says about the African people or the history of Africa. I quote, "Black people were incapable of thinking in any reflective manner," end of quote. Quoted from Zenweke and Kanu again in 2012. Therefore, I want to say that the engagement in the areas of arts is thoughtless and antithesis of human intellect. Mazuri continues to quote Rousseau there. This is crazy. But it was as a result of the intellectualism of the day that the colonialists and the settlers to the African continent depended on as they come to Africa. You can imagine the kind of interaction and the assumptions they made as they met and interacted with the African people. Once again, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the poetic phrase, "Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," echoed the same sentiments when he concluded that Black people could not create their own poetry. The devaluing of African moral and ethical thought systems and value systems as we can see, played a significant role in how African philosophy played out in the 18th and the 19th centuries. Indeed, according to Auguste Comte, the French philosopher associated with sociological positivism of the day, wrote that the Africans specifically lacked the Europeans' sophisticated linguistic skills, scientific capabilities, and political faculties. Thus, they were best suited to dancing with painted bodies, dressing in African regalia, and singing native song in their wilderness. Well, that's Comte, French philosopher, writing about or speaking about the Africans. West African scholars by the name of Zenweke and Kanu again in 2012 write that Africans had legitimate systems of authentic religious beliefs, coupled with advanced linguistic skills and scientific practices long before any other form of civilization came to Africa. But these were neglected or replaced with Western ideas. Should I start naming some of them? Maybe not. What for? Not at this particular point. Now, imagine any intellectual coming to Africa after reading any book on Africa and the African people by any of these scholars that I'm mentioning above, or I've just mentioned before here. I bet they were all biased, right? The settlers and the colonizers thought of the Africans as naive and empty-minded and incapable of making any sound moral and ethical decisions. The decisions are to be made for them by those who consider themselves to be more superior. This is history, my friends. And the only way we can interact on the same level is to understand about our past. The fact of the matter is that the undermining of African culture, African science, and development was an open denial of the existence of intellectual life and a hidden motive to dehumanize the African people and advance the acquisition of African land and resources. Why does this sound like it's still happening today? Go figure that one out and let me know in the chat below. By the way, you have the freedom to push back on any of this information that I'm saying, I share with you here in this channel. Feel free to object and to share your educational thoughts, because I believe iron sharpens iron. We have established that the incoming expatriates, the explorers, and the missionaries undermined and often ignored the social structures, moral and ethical structures, and worldview of the African people. The philosophical concepts and scientific and biological theories perpetuated by these elite scholars of the 16th through the 19th century conditioned the mindset of incoming Europeans and their perceptions of the native African people. That goes without saying, right? So these philosophies and philosophers, theories, influence the attitudes and perceptions of the incoming missionaries. These faulty philosophical and biological theories affected the Europeans' initial relationship with the Africans. This flawed initiation approach or initial approach to African morality and ethics influenced the African perception of the Christian faith and Christian education. According to Greenfield and Drugers write that in 2001. Getonga writes that in 2008. Masri has the same opinion from 2002. And so does Mugambi, writing in 2002. So this is not Joseph's opinion. Missionaries' efforts to the first tribes of Africa, or to maybe the Kenyan people in particular, and the rest of Africa, failed to consider and acknowledge African culture, African philosophy of life, African morality, and African context. Most of the early African Christian believers had therefore no choice but to understand the teachings of biblical Christianity through the lenses of African systems of thought and culture, mixed with the new teachings, and the result was obvious. This mixing gave birth to religious syncretism, which is the mixing of faith elements from one or two religions, tradition, and customs into one. And I can give you quite a number of scholars who would agree with me on that statement. And as a result, we know that African indigenous beliefs and practices began to be absorbed slowly and adapted into the Christian faith, according to uh, uh, Felder in 1996. Richard Gaiman writes in 1989. Magessa writes that in 2014. B.T. John writes that in 1975. And so many other scholars agree with me on that. So you had Christianity that looked like it was contextualized to reflect African values, but it was not African, neither was it westernized. It was neither but a mixture of both, a mixed thing of stuff. It was syncretistic in nature. It is therefore very clear that anthropological and missiological assumptions made by Western missionaries and explorers regarding the African continent may have given birth to the first waves of religious syncretism in many parts of Africa. This pitfall began with the gospel presenter or the incoming missionary embracing a false view of the gospel and a faulty perception of the African native or comfort, and a faulty view of his culture and his ethics and culture and morality, and a faulty view of the theological and religious perceptions of the Africans. In the case, or in this case, both the communicator and the receiver had mistaken identities regarding their spiritual position in the eyes of God. All were fallen, and salvation is by grace alone through faith. Sola gratia and sola fide. In the case of Africa, therefore, the gospel communicators perceive themselves as being a more superior breed as communicated to them by their contemporaries in the areas of science and biology and philosophy. The incoming communicators of the gospel perceive themselves as being cultural saviors of a people who are primitive, dressed in probably no clothes at all, and are people who had no historical significance. The incoming settlers and colonizers in the 18th and the 19th century, and some of the missionaries saw themselves as social redeemers to a fallen native African people, a people who needed redemption through the gospel of Christ. Salvation, therefore, for the African natives meant that they had to first purify their culture and their customs and traditions so that it resembles Western culture. Failure to comply meant that the African natives did not qualify to be Christianized and to receive the new faith. Chinua Achebe writing that in 1951, or Kurt P. Bitek writes that in 1965. Richard Gaiman writes that in 1989. John Beatty, 1975. Ali Mazrui, 1980. And of course, Thiongo Husso seconds that in 1965. So the historical and anthropological cultures of African people were assumed. They were ignored and perceived as primitive, while the culture of the incoming missionaries were regarded as spiritually being superior and morally acceptable. Chinua Achebe again supports that. Ali Mazrui and Mugambi, Muketha, and quite a number of other scholars there, including Zenweke and Madu in 2006. These faulty perceptions held by early European settlers and explorers and missionaries provided a fertile ground for African converts to embrace both Christianity and African traditional religions as complete and compatible religions with Christianity. Well, this has been Can You Believe It? Let's stop there for today so we can process what we just learned. We believe all truth is God's truth, and our responsibility as scholars is to dive to the bottom of the ocean under that pressure, scoop that fine sand, and bring it to the surface for inspection. And after we have done our due diligence, share it with the rest of humanity, both big and small. Remember to subscribe to this great channel that does not apologize for truth, but shares the truth as it is. This is Can You Believe It? Join us next time as we continue to explore this issue of how did we get here.